The number sitting in your savings account right now, it probably won't save you. I know that sounds harsh, especially if you followed every piece of smart financial guidance out there and stacked away 3 to 6 months of living costs. But here's the truth nobody in personal finance is willing to say out loud. That cushion you're so proud of is built on assumptions that stopped being true years ago. The financial landscape shifted underneath all of us, and the advice stayed frozen in place. My name is Nora, and what I do on this channel is cut through financial noise and show you what's actually happening in people's real money lives. What I've seen over and over again is this. Hardworking, responsible people follow the conventional playbook on emergency savings, pat themselves on the back for being prepared, and then get completely blindsided when a real crisis lands. If you want to understand why the savings target you've been working toward may not protect you, or if you're starting from scratch and want to do this right the first time, make sure you subscribe and tap the like button if this ends up being useful. Here's the belief that almost everyone holds. Park 3 to 6 months of expenses into a high-yield savings account, and you're covered for whatever life throws at you. That logic worked reasonably well around 2010. In 2026, it's not just incomplete, it's actively misleading. The price tag on emergencies has ballooned, the rate at which crises occur has gone up, and the nature of what people face during a financial emergency has changed fundamentally from what that old formula was designed to address. Yet everyone keeps repeating it, treating it as gospel, and calling it financial maturity. Let me walk you through what happens when real people in 2026 actually go through a real emergency, because numbers on a spreadsheet only tell half the story. Take Jennifer. She's 29, pulling in $72,000 annually, and she genuinely did everything by the book. Her monthly spending runs about $4,000, so she built up $18,000, a clean 6 months cushion. She felt solid. She was more prepared than most people in her social circle. Financial security felt real and within reach. Then her employer cut her entire department. Tech sector contraction. Nothing she did wrong, nothing she could have seen coming. She wasn't panicking at first because $18,000 sitting in savings felt like a serious runway. 6 months to find work, that seemed like more than enough time. Here's what the next 4 months actually looked like. Month 1, she applied for unemployment benefits and began the job hunt. The unemployment checks added up to roughly $1,800 a month. Her bills hadn't changed, still $4,000. She pulled $2,200 out of savings to cover the difference. Remaining balance, $15,800. Month 2, the job market was brutal. Everyone from her field had been let go simultaneously, and they were all applying for the same limited openings. She flew to another city for an interview that seemed promising, $800 in unavoidable travel costs. Didn't get the offer. Another $2,200 out for living expenses. Balance, $12,800. Month 3, her car broke down. The repair estimate came to $2,800. She could have patched it with a cheaper fix, but she needed a dependable vehicle for the moment she landed a new role. Between the repair and her monthly costs, $5,000 left her savings that month. Balance, $7,800. Month 4. A job offer finally came through at $68,000, a modest step down, but she needed income. The catch was relocation. Security deposit, first month's rent, a moving truck, travel, and all the setup costs that come with establishing a new home somewhere else totaled another $6,000. Her emergency fund was sitting at $1,800 before she had even started the new job. Part of the moving expenses went onto a credit card. She thought 6 months of expenses was a fortress. What she had was a 4-month window, and that's without a single medical bill, no dental emergency, no family crisis adding pressure. Just a layoff, a car repair, and the financial cost of transitioning back into employment. She started that new job carrying debt and an empty savings account, financially weaker than she was before the emergency began. This is the shape of a crisis in 2026. Costlier than the old models assumed, more frequent than people expect, and they pile on top of each other in ways that compound the damage because emergencies rarely arrive alone. Let's look at why the dollar cost of emergencies has exploded. Casts today are rolling computers. When something fails, you're not replacing a simple mechanical part anymore. You need proprietary diagnostics and specialized labor. A repair that ran $800 5 years ago now runs $2,000 or more. Medical emergencies are similarly devastating even with insurance coverage. A single unexpected hospital visit can trigger $3,000 to $5,000 in out-of-pocket costs between your deductible and annual maximums. Dental care operates in its own expensive universe. A single root canal runs $2,000. If you own property, home system failures are catastrophic. Replacing an HVAC unit costs $8,000 to $12,000, while a full roof replacement lands anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000. The mental model behind the traditional emergency fund assumed a crisis would cost somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000, a manageable hit your buffer could absorb without being destroyed. But in 2026, a single emergency can eliminate 20 to 30% of your savings, even when you've saved the recommended amount. Run into two emergencies inside the same 6 months, which is more common than people like to admit, and you're out of runway, despite having followed the advice perfectly. There's another structural flaw in how the traditional formula works. It uses your current monthly expenses as the baseline, but when an emergency strikes, your costs don't shrink to match your reduced income. They typically grow. You're driving more for interviews, you might need new certifications or training to strengthen your candidacy. Relocation becomes a real possibility for better opportunities. Stress takes a physical toll that eventually shows up as health costs. Your routine breaks down, and the financial friction that comes with chaos adds up quietly but consistently. Jennifer's normal monthly budget was $4,000. Once her life derailed, her actual spending ran closer to $5,000 when you factor in the job search-related expenses, the car repair, the moving costs, and all the small, elevated costs that come with an unsettled life. Her 6-month emergency fund, built around $4,000 months, should theoretically have given her $24,000 worth of breathing room. With actual emergency mode spending at $5,000 per month, plus the major lump sum hits, her fund was gone in 4 months. The gap between what the formula predicted and what reality demanded was brutal. Now let's talk about the single biggest shift that makes the old emergency fund advice most dangerous, and it doesn't get enough attention. Job searches simply take longer now than the advice was designed around. The traditional guidance assumed that finding comparable work in your field would take 3 to 6 months. That might have been accurate 20 years ago. Today, it's wishful thinking. The average professional job search in 2026 runs 4 to 8 months. Longer if you're in a specialized discipline, or if a wave of industry layoffs means you're competing against dozens of people with identical credentials for each open position. So what this means in practice is that saving 6 months of expenses puts you at the absolute edge of the median job search timeline. You find a role in month 6, but your first paycheck doesn't arrive until month 7. Your savings are exhausted, you're bridging that final stretch with debt before you've even earned $1 at the new job. That's precisely what Jennifer experienced, and it plays out for thousands of people every year who genuinely thought they'd prepared adequately. There's one more dynamic I want to address that almost nobody mentions when discussing emergency funds, what I call slow burn erosion. The assumption is that money parked in a high-yield savings account is sitting there protected and intact until you need it. Technically it is. Practically, it's losing value every year. Even in the current savings account environment, where you might earn 4% annually, inflation on the things households actually buy regularly, groceries, utilities, transportation, healthcare, is running at 5 to 6%. That gap means your emergency fund quietly loses 1 to 2% of its real purchasing power each year just by sitting still. Jennifer's $18,000 fund, saved 2 years before she needed it, had the effective purchasing power of roughly $16,500 by the time the crisis hit, measured against what emergencies actually cost in 2026. The car repair that would have been $1,800 2 years prior was now $2,800. The moving costs she could have covered for $4,000 back then now ran $6,000. Her savings amount never changed, but the price of the emergencies it was meant to cover had risen around it. This is why your emergency fund always feels like it's not quite enough, because in real terms, it's smaller the longer you go without needing it. So, if 3 to 6 months is dangerously inadequate, what is the right target for an emergency fund in 2026? The answer is uncomfortable for most people. 12 months of expenses should be your baseline, not your stretch goal, your minimum. Here's why that number makes sense. 12 months gives you realistic coverage for the actual average length of a professional job search with room to spare. It absorbs multiple expensive emergencies, the car repair and the medical bill and the moving costs, without being wiped out. It provides cushion against the inflation erosion that happens while the money sits in savings. And it gives you space to recover from one financial setback before you're forced to handle the next. Even 12 months may not be enough depending on your circumstances. Industries with frequent contractions, volatile income streams, dependents relying on your earnings, chronic health conditions, and homeownership introduce risk layers that require more padding. Let me build out what a genuinely adequate emergency fund looks like for someone in Jennifer's income bracket. After taxes on $72,000, she's bringing home roughly $4,500 monthly against $4,000 in expenses. The traditional guidance caps out at $24,000. A realistic target in today's environment is at least $48,000, a full year of actual expenses, and closer to $60,000 when you account for elevated emergency spending and purchasing power erosion. I understand your reaction. $60,000 sitting in a savings account feels like financial malpractice when that same money invested in a diversified index portfolio could be compounding at 8 to 10% annually. That's a legitimate tension, and I'm not dismissing it. But let me show you why it's the wrong frame. Consider Sarah, 34, earning $85,000 with $5,000 in monthly expenses and $30,000 in emergency savings, actually above the traditional recommendation. During a complicated pregnancy, she was placed on bed rest at 7 months and couldn't work through the final 2 months before her baby arrived. Then she took 3 months of partially paid maternity leave. That's 5 months of significantly reduced or absent income. Medical out-of-pocket costs with insurance ran $8,000. Unexpected baby equipment and supplies added $3,000. Household help during bed rest cost $2,000. Her partner took unpaid leave to support her and the new baby, giving up $4,000 in income. Regular household expenses continued throughout at $5,000 a month, totaling $25,000 over the 5-month period. All in, $42,000. Her $30,000 emergency fund was depleted before month 4 ended, and they finished the experience carrying $12,000 in credit card debt, despite her having what every traditional financial framework would describe as a fully adequate emergency fund. This is where the conventional advice breaks down. It treats emergencies as singular, isolated events. The reality is that emergencies are complex and cascading. One thing fractures, which creates pressure that breaks something else, which opens a third vulnerability. And modern emergencies are expensive in ways that simply weren't true for previous generations building their careers. There's another design flaw in the standard calculation that gets overlooked entirely. The emergency fund has to simultaneously do 2 things. It needs to replace your lost income while you navigate the crisis, and it needs to fund the actual cost of resolving the emergency itself. Covering Jennifer's living expenses during the job search was only half the equation. The other half was $8,000 in medical bills, baby supplies, household help, and her partner's lost income. The 3 to 6 month formula only calculates for the first job, income replacement. It completely ignores the second job, which often costs just as much, sometimes more. For self-employed individuals, freelancers, and contractors, the traditional advice is even further from useful. You don't receive unemployment benefits when work disappears. Your income doesn't arrive in predictable equal installments. A great month might be followed by a terrible one for reasons entirely outside your control. For you, an emergency fund isn't a break glass in case of disaster tool. It's the basic financial infrastructure that makes your professional model sustainable. 3 to 6 months isn't a safety net for the self-employed. It's barely a cushion. You need a minimum of 12 months, and likely 18 to 24. Marcus can tell you why. He's a freelance graphic designer earning around $90,000 annually. He saved $36,000, more than the traditional recommendation, and he felt rightfully confident about it. Then, within the same month, his two largest clients, representing 60% of his revenue, both terminated the contracts. Budget cuts on their end, no reflection on his work quality. His monthly income dropped from $7,500 to $3,000. His expenses were $5,500. Rebuilding his client roster required time, energy, and money spent on marketing and professional networking. It took 5 months before his income recovered, and $27,000 of his emergency fund evaporated during that stretch. 6 months of savings barely got him through a completely predictable, routine type of setback for someone in his profession. Now to address the opportunity cost argument seriously, because it deserves a real answer rather than dismissal. Every dollar sitting in a savings account at 4% is a dollar not working in a broad market indexed fund, potentially returning 8 to 10% annually. Over many years, that gap compounds into a meaningful difference. This is genuinely true, and it's why the emergency fund question has to be answered in the context of your entire financial picture. If your total net worth is $60,000 and all of it lives in emergency savings, yes, you're likely being too conservative. Some of that capital should be growing. But if your net worth is $300,000 and $60,000 of it is in accessible savings, while the remaining $240,000 is invested across diversified assets, that's not wasteful. That's a thoughtful allocation between security and growth. Your emergency fund is the security layer. Your investments are the growth layer. Optimizing entirely for one at the expense of the other creates a different category of financial risk, just with a different shape. Here's the framework I use for sizing an emergency fund appropriately in 2026. Start with 12 months of current expenses. That's your floor. Add 3 months if your industry has a history of contraction or your income varies significantly month to month. Add another 3 months if you own your own home rather than renting. Add 3 more if you have children or other dependents. Add 3 months if you have any ongoing health conditions that could interrupt your income or generate large medical bills. Add 3 months if you're self-employed or run your own business. Add 6 months if your household has only one income earner. Run the math on that framework for someone self-employed, owning their own home, and raising 2 children, and you land around 24 months of expenses. I know that sounds extreme. It isn't. It reflects the actual risk profile of that person's life, the number of things that could go wrong, and what each one costs to survive. Yes, building that kind of emergency fund takes serious time. Yes, you're leaving investment returns on the table while you get there, but consider what's actually more expensive: sacrificing some compound growth on the front end or taking on high-interest debt in the middle of a crisis because your safety net failed. Jennifer rebuilt her financial life. She cleared the credit card debt from her relocation expenses. She rebuilt her savings, but this time she ignored conventional wisdom entirely. At 32, making $80,000 a year, she has $55,000 sitting in her emergency fund. People in her life think she's being excessively cautious. She considers herself simply honest because she lived through what happens when your savings account promises protection it isn't actually built to deliver. Here's what makes this conversation especially important in 2026 specifically. We are operating in a period of elevated economic instability across nearly every dimension. Job security is at its lowest point in a generation. Industries are being disrupted and restructured at a pace that makes 5-year career planning unreliable. Climate events are generating costly property damage at increasing frequency. Healthcare costs continue to outpace wage growth year after year, and the broader economic and political environment is generating layers of uncertainty that feed directly into personal financial risk. Every one of those trends raises both the likelihood of an emergency occurring and the price tag attached to surviving it. The emergency fund guidance built 10 or 20 years ago was calibrated for a fundamentally more predictable world. That world is gone. What this means practically is straightforward. Stop using the 3 to 6 month benchmark as your target. Pull up your actual monthly spending and calculate what 12 months of it looks like. Then layer in the risk factors that apply to your specific life and start building towards that real number, even if it takes years to get there. You'll be giving up some investment growth in the near term. What you'll be gaining is financial security that holds up when things actually fall apart, not just the appearance of it. Your emergency fund isn't undersized because you're disorganized or bad with money. It's undersized because the guidance you followed was written for a financial reality that no longer exists. Most people will read this, acknowledge it makes sense, and still aim for the old target because 12 months sounds intimidating and nobody wants to keep that much cash on the sidelines. Those are the people who will eventually learn the same hard lesson that Jennifer, Sarah, and Marcus each learned, that the old playbook doesn't cover the real game anymore. You don't have to learn it the hard way. You can build real coverage now, before you actually need it, because by the time you discover your emergency fund is too small, you're already in the middle of finding out.